Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James, and this is Uncas. She was the last one born. My favorite month is here. It's October, so just about everything is going to have something to do with Halloween. And that's Kathy. I've already decorated my yard, and I'm amassing my candy collection to ward off any pranks from those monsters disguised as children who are dressed up like monsters. Do vampires drink coffee? In my book, This Sucks, they do. Whether you're a bloodsucker or not, you need coffee. Swing by Organic Man Coffee Trike at 4501 McPherson and get the best coffee on earth. If it's too far to drive, go to organicmancoffeetrike.shop. I did a show on vampires back August 27th, 2016. So this is the second trip into the land of the undead. A vampire is a creature that subsists by feeding on the vital essence of the living, by either drinking blood or extracting energy. In European folklore, vampires are undead creatures that sometimes visited loved ones and caused mischief or death. They tended to visit the areas they lived in before joining the undead. They wore shrouds and were often described as bloated and ruddy or dark countenance. They wore what they had been buried in. Their bodies were slowly rotting away, and by drinking blood, the vampire was able to prolong their existence. They were neither alive nor dead. They were the undead. Some vampires didn't even drink blood or draw energy from their victims. A ghost seen hanging around a home might have been referred to as being a vampire. Sunlight wasn't really harmful to them physically. Seeing a rotting corpse coming, their intended victim could easily run away. This led to the undead moving about at night so they could sneak up on their next meal. Folks traveling at night had little means of driving the shadows away. A torch was useful, but it cost money that most people didn't have. When the sun went down, you either stayed inside or you ran the risk of an undead encounter. The whole coffin filled with dirt was a plot twist from the book Dracula. It was kind of based on legends. Some vampires did return to their coffin in the daytime, others hid in trees or caves. In most vampire movies, the vampire bites the victim on the side of the neck. The fang marks are usually halfway between the esophagus and the side of the neck. Those little bitty fangs used in the movies would never be able to poke nice round holes in the neck. The skin and the veins are too tough. When the hero, usually Peter Cushing, would discover there was a vampire running around, the fake fang marks would usually be not over the blood vessels, but they were off to the side. Yeah, still, I loved those old movies. They would have the fang marks like here at an angle. Here's something never shown in any movie. When a vampire bat drinks blood, it only holds on to the red blood cells. Salt water makes up about 55% of the red stuff. To be able to get more red blood cells on board, the bat will urinate, peeing out the salt water. Half of its meal is expelled on to its host. You never see that in a vampire movie. Makes that tuxedo a bit of a messy nuisance. I guess there might be Depends. Growing up watching Hammer films and TV shows like Coal Shack the Night Stalker, I was convinced you could kill a vampire by pounding a stake through their heart. As I grew older and I read more books, I discovered the stake through the heart was also a plot twist. Way back in the times of vampires were seen as a very real menace, the way to deal with them was to get a huge wooden stake about 4 or 5 feet long. You would drive it through their body, anywhere on the trunk, stomach, chest, it didn't matter. The stake was to be pounded or pushed into the ground deep enough to hold this creature in place. You then had to cut or chop its head off. This wouldn't necessarily kill this creature. Well, they're undead. They're already partially dead. You can't make them deader. What you had to do next was to cut their head off, while this creature is still thrashing about, trying to either kill you or get away from you, because even though he's staked to the ground, he's still very much capable of doing bad things to you. So you had to cut the head off, but this didn't necessarily kill them either. Once the head had been removed, it was placed facing backwards between the feet of the corpse and then reburied. Well, hopefully that would keep the vampire from being able to climb out of its grave at night because it couldn't see which direction it was digging. That was one of the many solutions to a vampire. Every time I hear people talk about putting in a hot water heater, I want to start slapping somebody. If the water's already hot, why are you trying to heat it? The thing is called a water heater, period. So you can't kill the undead. You can pin one down and cut off its head, which is then placed backwards between the feet, and rebury the vampire, but according to some legends, it would still be alive for however long it took it to dissolve. Sometimes the wood had to be from a special kind of a tree. Hawthorn was one kind of wood that was considered appropriate for pinning the creature down. Even in some legends, it was said that the hawthorn wood would kill a vampire. It just depends on which legend you're reading about. You can drag a vampire out into the sunshine, but this will only create a sunburnt undead being. Sunlight killing a vampire came about at the conclusion of Nosferatu when F.W. Murnau discovered that he was out of money, but he hadn't finished the movie yet. The scriptwriter got busy and came up with a plausible conclusion for the movie. Fire is recommended by some as a way to deal the final blow. Without a body to inhabit, the spirit should go away, hopefully away to some other dimension. However, a vampire can also become a ghost. Once in an ethereal form, the vampire might just follow you home and cause mischief and mayhem. Fire can be a bad idea when dealing with a Ouija board. You're not just destroying the object, you're releasing the spirit. Kind of the same way with a vampire. It has also been reported once a vampire dies or gets more dead, it can become a werewolf. The two creatures are thought to be the same general type of being. The whole vampires and werewolves don't get along started out as a Hollywood plot device. The movie Dracula versus the Wolfman was the first mention of any kind of animosity between these two groups of supernaturals. Depending on where you read, a werewolf can turn into a vampire and vice versa. By destroying one of its ways it is manifest, you're simply pushing the spirit into the other form. So you kill the vampire, and now you get a werewolf running around, or you kill the werewolf, and now you have a vampire. Vampiric entities have been recorded in cultures around the world. The term vampire was popularized in Europe after reports of an 18th century rash of unexplained deaths, along with pre existing folklore in southeastern and eastern Europe. That is, in some cases, it resulted in corpses being dug up and staked to the ground and then reburied. People were also being accused of vampirism. Local variants in Southeast Europe were also known by different names, such as Strikaga in Albania, Vrykolakas in Greece, and Strigai in Romania. The most popular vampires here in the US are those coming from Eastern Europe legends. We can thank Bela Lugosi for most of the modern vampire characteristics. The notion of vampirism has existed for thousands of years. Cultures such as the Mesopotamians, the Hebrews, ancient Greeks, and the Romans had tales of demons and spirits which were considered precursors to the modern vampires. Vlad Tepes, or Vlad the Impaler, was turned into a vampire by Bram Stoker. Vlad was a mass murderer, but there's no real report of his ever drinking blood or turning into a bat. Most stories of him dipping his bread in the blood was put out as bad press, mostly out of Germany. Here's another thing Hollywood tries to do that drives me nuts. A 150-pound man turns into a half-pound flying mammal. What happened to the other 149 and a half pounds of person? In my book, This Sucks, the vampire turns into a 150-pound bat. And he can't fly because humans have never learned how to fly. Just because you have wings doesn't mean you know how to use them. The Mesopotamian vampire was one of the 7 evil spirits of Assyria. They were depicted as having dogs' heads, kind of like our dog man from today. Could there be a connection between the two? Something for another show. These dog headed beings sustained themselves by drinking blood, usually from a living human. In some legends, these creatures came from the oceans and were neither male nor female. They would travel inland, preying on the inhabitants, and then return to the oceans. Another blood sucking monster was known as the Edimu, a ghostly spirit that sucked the life force out of people's bodies. These were the departed souls of dead people that had been cursed or denied eternal rest because of some unredeemed sin. They sustained themselves by killing humans. They caused disease and inspired criminal activity in the living. The Edemu were also thought to be wind spirits that sucked the life out of people not on their guard or while people were sleeping, usually the very young. This could have been their explanation for crib death, or maybe it was the cause. I could find writings on how to prevent a person from becoming an edemu, but nothing on how to kill one once it was hanging around. I say kill, even though the creature was undead. It's just another way of saying destroy or vanquish. There were writings on magic spells and amulets to be used to keep the bloodsucker away, but nothing on how to destroy one. In the Highlands of Scotland, the Ba Van Shee were blood sucking fairies who haunted mountain paths and roads that crisscrossed the highlands. These blood sucking fairies preyed on unsuspecting travelers and hunters. Sometimes known as the White Women of the Highlands, these creatures usually appeared as a beautiful young woman wearing a long green dress that concealed their legs. These women had the legs and feet of deer. This sounds an awful lot like the not deer the guys on Expanded Perspectives talk about. These beings were attracted to the smell of animal blood on hunters' clothes. Instead of attacking, the Bavanshi would entice their victims to come closer. Nothing to be afraid of here, just one or two young ladies. Any unsuspecting man who got too close would find himself being invited to a dance. This dance would cause the men to slowly fall into a trance. Once sufficiently subdued, a vampire would reveal its great long claws used to tear open the victim so they could drink the blood as it spilled from the body. During the daylight hours, the Bavan she vampire would sleep in a coffin. They could disguise themselves as wolves or crows, but while in animal form, they had few of their magical powers. To kill a Bavanshi, you had to drive an iron bar through its body or trap it inside its coffin during the day by building a huge stone cairn, a pile of stones used as a marker, on top of the box. Then this creature would either die from a lack of food or simply waste away. One of my favorite episodes of The Night Stalker was the Rakshasa. This is a legendary creature from India that is depicted as either eating humans or drinking their blood, depending on the story. They are described as being basically human looking, only they stand much taller, 7 or 8 feet tall, and they have massive arms and legs. They have great long fangs that are used to devour people. If the Rakshasa is going to drink its victim's blood, they would use a cup or their hand. The body is torn open, allowing the red stuff to flow. The fangs were used to eat people, not poke holes in them. There were both good and evil Rakshasa. As warriors, they fought alongside the armies of both good and evil. They were powerful warriors, expert magicians, illusionists. They could also change how they looked. They could assume different physical forms, such as taking on the image of somebody you knew and trusted. In order to kill a Rakshasa, you needed a special weapon that had been blessed by the gods. In a few stories, the hero was strong enough to strangle one of these monsters with his bare hands. The beings could fly, they could spit fire, and they could possess dead corpses, using them to attack their enemies. In The Night Stalker, Carl was handed a blessed crossbow, and he used it to kill Miss Emily. Well, actually, Rakshasa had disguised itself to look like Miss Emily, and then Carl had to shoot her, killing the creature. The crucifix was introduced by the church as a defense against vampires in the Middle Ages, possibly to keep religion uppermost in people's minds, or maybe to help the superstitious people feel a bit more secure. I get a kick out of the old paintings depicting Jesus as a child holding a cross. I've seen many of them. I don't think the cross was quite a religious symbol yet, but yet a lot of old painters would put him holding a cross. I saw one where Mary had a cross hanging around her neck while she was still pregnant. Oh well, artistic license, I guess you could call it. Before the cross was used to ward off vampires, people used other items, including types of wood or herbs, religious symbols of other types, and folk remedies. I don't think the object was actually what held the power. I think that the faith of the person using it is what drove the vampire away. The idea a vampire can't see its own reflection came about back when mirrors were made using thin sheets of silver on the back of glass. Silver was considered to be a sacred metal, and so it repelled the image of the bloodsuckers. Garlic has been used in spiritual activities and ceremonies for centuries. Its origins can be traced back to ancient times when it was used in religious rituals and as a natural remedy for just about everything. The use of garlic in spiritual practices is thought to date back to the Egyptians, who used it in their ceremonies and rituals. They believed that garlic had the power to ward off evil spirits and protect against disease. In ancient Greece, garlic was used as an offering to the gods. It was also believed to have medical properties and was used to treat a variety of illnesses. During the Middle Ages, garlic was thought to possess magical powers. It was used to ward off vampires and other supernatural creatures. It was also believed to protect against witchcraft and black magic. Garlic cloves would be woven together and placed over doorways and windows to keep those pesky monsters away. The idea a vampire has to be invited into a home goes back at least to the 17th century. The Vrykolaikos, a harmful undead creature in Greek folklore, cannot harm the occupants of a house unless they invited the undead inside. If you've heard about the black eyed children, which you should have by now, you'll know that they have this same quirk. They knock at the door and they ask to be let in. People encountering them say they felt overpowered as if someone was manipulating their thoughts. This leads me to believe there really is something magical about doorways. For some odd reason, my nose itches. Feels like I've got something sticking in it. What's this? Okay. The threshold of a house is considered a magical or a protective barrier that gives security to the home. Vampires cannot enter a house without an invitation because they would become weakened or lose all of their powers should they enter uninvited. The idea that vampires have to be invited in represents concepts like humans being invited, or human beings inviting evil into their lives, or God and or the powers of good trying to protect human beings from evil. One of the more popular notions is that vampires must return to their grave after sating their bloodlust. They have to sleep in a coffin until he rises again the next night. In Bram Stoker's Dracula, the creature brings several coffins with him when he travels to Europe, or to England, I'm sorry. In the bottom of each coffin was some earth from his grave. This could lead us to believe that sleeping in a coffin is a sure sign that a person is a vampire. Well, there are actually some people out there that do sleep in coffins that are not vampires, although they dress the part. Vampires are mentioned in historical writings long before coffins came into use. The coffin was the embellishment to the vampire stories throughout most of European countries. During the Middle Ages, it was common for plague victims to be buried and then dug back up so that more bodies could be added to these mass graves. The people tasked with digging up old graves would sometimes find bodies that had dark blood like substance coming from their noses and their mouths. The workers believed that this was a sign that these bodies must be vampires, and they were responsible for perpetuating the plague. To prevent these people from climbing from their graves to feed on others, the workers would sometimes shove bricks or rocks into the corpses' mouths in hope that doing so would stop the plague from spreading further. Some bodies would have an iron bar driven through the chest to keep them in the grave. The bodies discovered by archaeologists while researching a plague burial site is evidence of these practices. John Barber was a farmer who lived in Griswold, Connecticut back in the 1800s. He died in 1855 and he was buried in the local cemetery. In 1990, the graves of small local cemeteries were being moved to a newer, bigger final resting place. John Barber was dug up, and the workers found the lid of his coffin had JB 55 written on the lid using brass tacks. The lid was in sad shape, so the coffin was opened to see about placing John in a better box. The skeleton of John Barber had its ribs broken as if somebody had been beating on the chest. This had been done about 5 years after he was in the ground. His legs had been broken, and the thigh bones, the skull had been moved to form a skull and crossbones inside the coffin. Looking into this bizarre representation, it was learned that this was believed to be a way of keeping a vampire in their coffin. The locals had been plagued by consumption, better known as TB today, which was often blamed on vampires. Coffins would be dug up and any suspected bloodsuckers would be dealt with in a similar fashion. The idea John might have been a vampire might strike some as being just superstition, but the number of cases of TB fell off after he was dug up the first time. In 2006, archaeologists in Italy had a unique vampire sighting of their own. They discovered the remains of what is believed to have been a female vampire with a brick forced into her jaw. Italian forensic archaeologist Matteo Borini reported the find when the discovery took place. Researchers were investigating a 1576 mass grave of medieval Venetian plague victims at the time of the discovery. Villagers living in Kadam, Bohemia in 1706 were being attacked by a vampire that didn't drink their blood or even really attack anyone. A herdsman named Myslata of Blue, Blau, had died and was buried in the church cemetery. For weeks after he had been buried, people would see Myslata walking around town. On occasion, he would see somebody he recognized from before joining the undead, and he would address them by name. These folks would tell others about their late night encounter with this undead being. Each of these people, who had their names called out by Maeslata, would die within a few days. Those who saw him but he didn't acknowledge their presence would continue living. Maeslata became known as the Blau Vampire. As more people reported encountering Maeslata, the officials decided that something had to be done. Can't have dead people wandering around at night. The officials had Maeslata dug up and a stake was hammered into his chest. The body was reburied, and everybody thought, well, that's the end of the late night encounters. Within a few days, people came forward saying they had once more seen my Slata wandering around town, and a few of these folks died within days of their encounter. The vampire was now being seen holding the stake like it was a club. He was using it to drive away the town's dogs that would get too close. So much for asking the experts. The villagers were at their wits' end. If staking the vampire didn't work, what could they do next? The authorities contacted an executioner, somebody who was paid to dispatch the living, to try and take care of this undead being. The executioner arrived in town. He had the body dug up once more. Several dozen white thorn stakes were pounded through the body, which was then set on fire. The vampire didn't go out quietly. His screams could be heard throughout the village. It took several hours before the flames died down and nothing remained of the undead but ashes. With the Treaty of Passarowitz, signed in 1718, the Habsburg monarchy annexed most of Serbia and a good portion of Bosnian territory, which had been part of the Ottoman Empire. During this 20-year period, these boundaries districts were subject to direct military rule from Vienna for strategic, fiscal, and other reasons. As a result of the devastation brought about by the previous Austrian Ottoman wars, these areas were in pretty bad shape. With the scarce and partly nomadic population, there was very little agriculture. Most of these folks herded cattle, which could be moved from place to place. The Austrian authorities sought to further economic development and to attract German speaking Serbian settlers to this new territory. Many of the Serbs, especially those who had immigrated from Ottoman held areas, were recruited as militiamen for the peacetime protection of the borders and for regular military service during any wartime. Instead of a paycheck, they were given land. It was in these communities that the earliest well documented vampire attacks were reported. Arnold Paole was a Serbian hatchduk, a part time soldier. Any time the military was needed, he would be called to put on his uniform and go wherever the trouble was. During one call up, Arnold was sent to a village near the Turkish controlled part of Serbia. Once he was released from his duties, Arnold told people about some of the things he'd seen and done while away from home. He often talked about the encounter he had with a vampire. The vampire had managed to knock Arnold down and bite him, sucking his blood. I'm not sure where the wound was. It was never mentioned in any of the records. This happened in a town named Gasawa, which some folks now believe is Kosovo. When asked about his wounds, Arnold told his listeners that he had been told by the locals to cure the vampire bite, he needed to eat dirt from the vampire's grave and then scrub himself with the blood from the undead. Arnold said that this had worked because, well, here he was, alive and well. While working his farm sometime in 1725, Arnold took a tumble from a hay wagon, breaking his neck. His body was buried in the local cemetery, and everybody went on with their lives. People began to see Arnold walking around the village in the middle of the night. They were positive it was him, even though they knew he was dead. A few of these witnesses said that Arnold attacked them. He ran at them with their arms stretched out, trying to grab them. The witnesses were all able to outrun the dead man. After a few days, a few of these witnesses died suddenly. These folks suddenly began to simply waste away, dying within days. With the death of the fourth witness, people began to suspect that Arnold was to blame, and he must have not cured his vampirism as he had thought. Most of these victims had said they saw Arnold late at night, days before growing ill and passing away. The village was run by the military, and they had an army officer instead of a mayor. The villagers went to Lieutenant Schneiser and demanded action. The officer had traveled all over Europe and had run into similar things in the past. He had Arnold's body dug up for examination. The corpse looked fresh, as if he had only died the day before. It had been over a month since Arnold was buried. His hair looked a bit longer, and his beard was full. The officer said Arnold was indeed a vampire, and he ordered one of the villagers to drive a stake through his chest. As the stake pierced the flesh, Arnold let out with a loud scream. He tried to grab the man doing the pounding. Arnold tried to pull the stake out even as it was being driven through him. Once the stake was sufficiently deep, the coffin was reburied. The villagers also dug up all of the victims of Arnold, and they drove a stake through each of their heart as well. The villagers were told that this incident was over and that nobody should be bothered by Arnold ever again. About 5 years later, in the winter of 1731, a new outbreak occurred, with more than 10 people dying within a few weeks, some of them in just 2 or 3 days. None of these folks had any previous illness. They suddenly grew too weak to get out of bed and died within a day or two. The numbers and the ages of the deceased vary somewhat between the two main sources of the reports, but the number usually stays around a dozen or so. To ward off attacks by vampires, families moved in together so that several of them could stand watch all night while the others slept. Any religious symbols that were available were placed all around any openings. Garlic cloves, onion, certain kinds of wood were brought into the homes as well. Being under the control of Austria, the locals were told to contact Vienna. It took a while for word to get back saying that an army unit was being sent to investigate these deaths. Doctors Flukinger and Glaser arrived along with a small detail of soldiers to look into what was going on and to see if they could find a solution. The doctors set up their office in a few buildings in town and they began interviewing any witnesses as to these deaths. They documented all of their findings. Each house where someone had died was examined. No signs of any disease could be found. The others living in close proximity were all perfectly healthy. Only one person in each household had died. The sick had complained of stabbing pains in their sides and a pain in their chest. They all had a prolonged fever and a jerking of their limbs just before they died. Glazer reported that the locals considered two of the female victims, Malika, who was 69, and Stana, who was 20 years old, to have started this latest vampiric epidemic. According to the doctor, Malika had come to the village from Ottoman-controlled territory 6 years before she died. The locals said she'd always been a good neighbor, and to the best of their knowledge, she had never believed or practiced anything diabolical. She had once mentioned that while still in Ottoman lands, she had eaten 2 sheep that had been killed by a vampire. Stana had told her neighbors while she was living in Ottoman territory there had been dozens of vampire attacks all around the area. She and the other villagers had smeared themselves with blood from one of the vampire's victims in order to ward off attacks by these bloodsuckers. Depending on which part of the region you lived in, some thought that tainted blood would protect you, while others believed this was how you became a vampire. Eating anything a vampire had killed was either considered to be safe or not, depending on who you asked. Both doctors wrote reports on who all had died, where they had come from, who they had had contact with, anything that might lead to a conclusion to these bizarre deaths. Documents were dispatched to Vienna to be read and commented on by other medical professionals. The army was also involved in trying to find out why these people were dying. In a few reports, the victims had said they'd seen the dead attacking them in their homes. A young girl named Stanaska had awoken in the middle of the night screaming. Her folks ran in and found her gasping for breath. She told them a neighbor, who had died 2 months ago, had attacked her trying to bite her on the throat. The following day, Stanaska was too weak to get out of bed. She died 2 days later. The body of the man who was supposed to have attacked her was dug up, and he was found in perfect condition. He hadn't rotted at all. A stake was hammered into his chest, and then the body reburied. People were beginning to say that these stakes weren't doing any good. Something more had to be done to get rid of these vampires that were coming out of their graves at night. During the height of this outbreak, the lieutenant suddenly grew sick and died. More doctors and more surgeons, along with a lot more soldiers, were dispatched from Vienna. January 7th, together with the village elders and some local gypsies, they opened the graves of all of the deceased. Their findings were similar to Glaser's, although their reports contain much more anatomical detail. The commission established that, while 5 of the corpses had decomposed, the remaining 12 were quite complete and undecayed. These bodies exhibited traits that were commonly associated with vampires. Their stomachs and in some cases other organs were found full of fresh blood. The internal organs were found to be in good condition. Some corpses looked plump and their skin had a red, vivid coloring. The surgeons, doctors, and military officials summarized their meeting by saying that the bodies were in vampiric condition. After the exhumation had been complete, the gypsies were called on to cut off the heads of the vampires, set their bodies on fire. Once the fire was out, all the ashes were collected and then thrown into a nearby river. The bodies that didn't show signs of being vampires were simply reburied in the cemetery. The final report was written up January 26th, 1732, and it was signed by several doctors and all of the army officers. With time, a few more reports turned up. One had been written by Lieutenant Schneiser before he had died. The report was from 1726, and it went into some details of Arnold Paoli's life and death. It turned out that Arnold had killed 4 or maybe 5 people and several farm animals. These dead animals had been eaten by their owners instead of being disposed of. Life in the area was hard, and you didn't throw away food unless you absolutely had to. The second vampire attack was being blamed on Arnold and not the two women. The entire account was written up in the newspapers in Vienna and other parts of Austria. It is considered one of the best recorded vampire stories out there. In Bulgaria, vampires are believed to start out as ghost like creatures before they could physically rise from the grave. In its early stages, the vampire could only be seen faintly by the human eye. During the night, their ghostly form could be seen as sparkling shapes coming up from their graves. With time, and after consuming a few meals, the ghost would become a corporal entity. In 1863, the village of Dikakue was plagued by dozens of these sparkling shapes that the locals decided were vampires. The vampires began attacking the villagers. They hung out in people's yards, screaming all night long at those inside. After a few nights of this activity, these sparkly beings began throwing cow droppings at images of saints that were stuck up throughout the village. The vampires had not been able to take physical form. They still needed to acquire a lot more food. Their shapes could be seen in the streets as these sparkling humanistic forms. A local witch decided it was time to do something about these undead creatures. She went to the cemetery and she waited to see which graves the vampires came from. She noticed that some small holes were found around the graves of the creatures that were used to come and go through. She stuffed these holes with some unknown substance, and it did the trick. No more sparkly vampires messing around with the villages. In some parts of Eastern Europe, the title witch could refer to an old woman who knew things like healing and herbal remedies. In a Bosnian village called Tupanari, a man named Paja Tomic died on April 9th, 1923. He and his wife had owned a small inn. A few days after the funeral, his wife, Vija, was visited by his ghost. She awoke in the middle of the night, and there he was, standing at the foot of the bed. People staying in the inn also saw Paja roaming about the building in the middle of the night. He would sneak into the rooms at night and wake them by screaming and yelling at them. Vija began to suspect that her late husband had become a vampire. Both her sons, Kirsto and Stevo, also had seen their dead father, and they began telling their neighbors about these late night visits and how their father was now a member of the undead. The two boys didn't much care for having a vampire for a father, so they sought help from the local priest. The priest didn't think the story could possibly be true, but he did mention a few old remedies for dealing with a vampire. The two boys enlisted the help of a few neighbors, and together they went to the cemetery and they dug up their old man. The body looked in too good a shape for having been dead for the last 2 weeks. One of the crowd shoved a hawthorn stake through Podge's chest. The body was then placed on a pyre and set ablaze. The ashes were collected and thrown into a river. There were no reports of anyone being attacked by this bloodsucker. Nobody died in the wake of his visits. Not even any of the farm animals within miles of the town were seen to have died from unknown causes. The body might have been destroyed before it could take on a full blown, blood drinking creature. In 1927, a young Haitian woman named Anastasia Diodon confessed in 1927 to repeatedly drugging her 9-year-old niece in order to drain blood from an incision that she had made between the girl's toes. She was a toe sucker. Anastasia told the authorities that she was compelled to drink blood each day. Her niece was a convenient victim, and so she drank her fill, despite the possible damage to the younger girl. The authorities believed this vampire was most likely just a mentally ill woman. Her story was published in the St. Petersburg Times in 1927. Anastasia had preyed on her niece for months, causing her to lose weight and have little to no energy. Neighbors said the young girl looked like a walking corpse. When the doctor finally was able to examine the niece, he told the authorities that she was the victim of a vampire. They arrested Anastasia and they sent her to a mental hospital. The main characteristic of a vampire is they drink blood, preferably from humans. Anastasia wasn't one of the undead, but she was a vampire. Why she was driven to drink blood? Nobody knows, or they're just not saying. Tracy of Rill Wigginton was born August 4th, 1965. She grew up in Rockhampton in northern Australia. At the age of 3, her mother found that she could no longer raise a child after her divorce, and so Tracy was sent to live with her grandparents, who eventually adopted her. Would that make her mother her sister as well? The family attended Catholic church, and Tracy was a gifted artist. Once she became older, Tracy began telling people that her grandparents had been mean, nasty people. They were very controlling and abusive of her on occasion. Tracy said they didn't understand her being attracted to other girls, and they hated her for it. 1981, when she was 15, Wigginton's grandparents died for some unknown reason, and they they left her $75,000, which is about $310,000 today. Wigginton moved back in with her mother, who was not accepting of her lifestyle. Not wanting any more hassles at home, Tracy moved in with a close friend. Following a miscarriage, Wigginton stopped attending Mass and started hanging out with a local witch from Adelaide. Once she moved to Brisbane, Wigginton began to immerse herself in the occult. She kept black magic items on her body, and she used blood from animals to draw occult symbols. Drawing with blood eventually led to drinking it as well. Tracy would consume animal blood, not human. When animal blood no longer satisfied her, Tracy began planning to find someone she could use as her next meal. In 1989, Wigginton, aged 24, weighing in at 209 pounds and standing 6 feet tall, went out hunting along with 3 friends. Lisa Tashinsky, age 24, Kim Jarvis, 23, and Tracy Waugh, age 23. The 4 young women had been out drinking, and then they drove around in Wigginton's vehicle in search of a victim. Edward Baldock was a 47-year-old council worker and the father of 4. He had gone out drinking a bit too much and was waiting for a taxi when Wigginton and her 3 associates pulled up. The story on how they got him into the car is unclear. Maybe they simply offered him a ride, or maybe they offered him a fling of some sort. Depending on who told the story, suffice it to say, he went with them to the banks of the river where he got undressed. Wigginton stabbed him 27 times and then nearly cut his head off so she could drink his blood. When the police arrived, they found the dead body with his clothes neatly folded nearby. As they examined the clothing, they found Wigginton's bank card inside of one of Baldoc's shoes. How it got there is a mystery. The police arrested Wigginton and then her three friends. Wigginton confessed to the murder and said that she felt absolutely no remorse about the murder. She said she sat down and smoked a cigarette and watched her victim bleed to death. Sachinsky, Jarvis, and Waugh all said that Wigginton had vampiric tendencies. They said that was the reason for the murder, to enable her to drink the man's blood. 1991, a jury convicted Wigginton of murder, and she was sentenced to life imprisonment, which would be about 13 years before she could get parole. Sachinsky was also convicted of murder, Jarvis of manslaughter, and Waugh was acquitted. 2006, Wigginton assaulted a fellow inmate and a prison guard. 2008, Jaschinski was released. Wigginton made 4 unsuccessful parole applications until 2011, when the parole board granted her application. Wigginton was released from prison in January 2012, despite the fact that she had lied to the parole board. 2021, Wigginton was posting images on Facebook of vampires, witches, and a pile of skulls and bones. The officers who had investigated this case said that Wigginton's parole should be revoked, but so far, she's still on the outside. There are several groups whose purpose for being is to research vampires. I found out about this by listening to Trailer Trash Terrors. One of the most prominent modern vampirologists was Stephen Kaplan, the founder of the Vampire Research Center in 1972. There actually is a Vampire Research Center. The year before, he'd also founded the Parapsychology Institute of America. And over 2 decades, beginning in 1974, it was a popular lecturer in parapsychology for the New York City Board of Education. He initially attained some level of fame in the mid 1970s when he investigated the reported hauntings of a house on Long Island in Amityville, New York. The Amityville haunting was promoted in several books and a movie. Kaplan was the first to denounce the whole story as being a hoax. Today, there are a few other researchers who have come out saying the same thing. Further accounts of his parapsychology endeavors can be found in several books called True Tales of the Unknown and a number of other works on psychical research. That's a hard word for me to say right now. I've got a cat circling my chair. Kaplan first set out to rationalize vampirism. His first book, published in 1976, Pursuit of Premature Gods and Contemporary Vampires, called vampirism nothing more than psychological impairment. His second book was a completely different story. Published in 1984, Vampires Are discussed the real life vampires with which Kaplan had developed personal relationships. The Vampire Research Center. Kaplan also conducted the first ever official vampire census, estimating that there were nearly 200 actual vampires living or undead in North America. It is amazing what you can learn listening to podcasts. If you'd like to buy a copy of Vampires Are, you can get the paperback version for a mere $987, or you can get the hardcover for about $2,000. Vic Hermanson does a great job of portraying Kaplan as he interviewed a real life undead being named Elizabeth, who said that at the time she was 439 years old. It's what we call theater of the mind. The show is called I Can See Your Neck Veins Pulsing for Miles and Miles. Elizabeth had contacted the Vampire Research Center and spoke with Kaplan in the late 1970s. Kaplan talked to this woman over the course of the next year or so. He asked a lot of questions that we might all be interested in hearing the answers to. Elizabeth said that she had killed a person every day for over 400 years. That would be one huge pile of dead bodies somewhere. Today, if Elizabeth was a real vampire and hadn't run into any stakes and fires, she would be about 500 years old. She said she looked to be in her early 20s. The show is an hour and 30 minutes long, and it's worth every minute of it. John L. Velluntini is another vampirologist who was the editor of the Journal of Vampirology, published from 1984 to 1990. Valentini wrote most of the articles and based the majority of his work on vampire folklore. He believed vampirism was caused by a bacterial infection. Valentini also studied vampiric folklore in the regions of Africa. In Guyana in 2007, an elderly woman was lynched by a group of villagers who suspected her of being a haige. A haige is a spirit that can shift into the shape of an old woman and enter homes by passing through the keyhole. The locals had decided that this old lady was an evil spirit who was sneaking about at night drinking blood from babies and young children. This belief has roots in the Obe religion, which is still practiced in that region. Can a vampire possibly be real? A lot of people are going to think it's either Bela Lugosi or that weird kid from that TV show that I refuse to watch. The real vampire might look just like you and me, only revealing its true self when it's time for dinner. The idea of having a vampire kill and consume a person every day, well, that would be an awful lot of blood for anybody to consume. The human body holds about 5 liters of the red stuff. Who drinks that much of anything? The recommended amount of water per day is about 3 liters. Of course, if the vampires do like their furry little cousins, maybe they pee out the salt water and only keep the red stuff, which would amount to about 2¼ liters, which is about the right amount of fluids for a person or the undead. Keep in mind that some of the vampire reports were actual corpses that had come back to life, while others were people that were very much alive. In fact, one of them is very much alive today. Hope you enjoyed tonight's show. If you did, tell your friends, tell your neighbors, tell people you don't even know or like that they should be listening to Strange Things with Chris James. If you'd like to buy one of my books, you can find them at the Organic Man Coffee Trike on McPherson, or you can go to Amazon.com. Until next week, this is Chris James saying Happy Halloween and see you next time.